Good day, everyone, and welcome to this podcast about collaborative governance. We've just come out of a really interesting morning's discussion with a whole bunch of practitioners and researchers on the field and the topic of collaborative governance. My name is Andrew Borain, and I was very happy to be the facilitator of the morning session, which was convened by Synagos and by Kagiso Trust. So at this workshop, we heard three very interesting inputs. One was from CSIR, who's been working with Anglo-American on municipal capabilities and partnering program. In other words, how do municipalities work better with communities and business, particularly in the mining areas in 4 provinces. We heard about the small town regeneration program and experiences from SitePlan, which has covered many municipalities now, so there was a lot of rich experiences there. And then Salga presented their collaborative governance model, which they are piloting in 2 municipalities. So there was a lot of evidence and data coming up from the ground about what works and also what doesn't work, and what are the barriers and the difficulties that gets in the way of good collaborative governance. So I'm joined today by 3 guests on this podcast. First is Jeremy Marman, who's the Director of the Advancement of Community Initiative based in Piketberg in the Western Cape. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Then Marlene Ogawa, who works for Synagos, which does a lot of work, amongst other things, on bridging leadership. Very relevant for the topic of cooperative governance. And then Paul Smith, who heads up the Kagiso Trust Local Governance Program. So welcome to all of you. And can I just ask you to reflect on a very general question: what is cooperative governance and why is it important? Marlene, can we start with you?
Yeah, I think for me it comes back to how we relate, how we build trust, and how we jointly come up with solutions in the communities where we live and work. Collaborative governance for me is also very much about leadership, how we show up as individual leaders and how we integrate into the collective. Our work is very much about inner work for social change. And so the how we show up has to be intentional, and we have to show up with this openness to be collaborative. And so it's a lot of self-work that we have to do within ourselves. And as I think as South Africans, we come with a lot of baggage, trauma, hurt, and we have so many gifts and talents. And how do we show up with all of that as we work with others? So collaboration for me is very much a personal journey that we walk as we do our work and how we work with others as a collective. Thanks.
Marlene, let me push you a little bit on this.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we need co-development of say, joint solutions? I mean, Don't we elect councillors who appoint officials? Shouldn't they just be working on our behalf?
Yeah, I think when we think about place and communities, because we live there, we have to have a sense of ownership of what happens there, the problems and the solutions. And I think what we see and know for sure is that sense of ownership has to come from feeling a sense of purpose in the place that we live, in the sense of we want to do and we want to solve. So if we don't have the ownership of the issues, then we're not going to co-create the solutions to it. So what needs to happen is the authentic conversations around what's not working and how we solve it as a collective. And I think often that is not happening. The interdependence, that's so natural because we are interconnected beings, and we're not practicing that to find joint solutions that creates the ownership and the sustainability of what we come up with as a collective.
I mean, I certainly agree with you that it does start with place and then place making.
Yeah.
Because if a place doesn't have a common identity And if it doesn't have a sense of ownership and belonging, then it's a nothing place.
Yeah.
Then it's a fragmented place.
Yeah.
I mean, Jeremy, what's your take on the importance of cooperative governance?
My take on this is really almost going to what was governance or government for? Right? It is for people, isn't it? And if it's for people, often how we approach development or governance, it comes from a rights-based approach. It's like we have a right to these things, a right to clean water, for example. But with these rights come responsibilities. And those responsibilities need to be upheld by the people in that place. And I feel oftentimes we tend to forget that we all have a responsibility. We focus very much on our rights. And oftentimes those very resources that are put in place that we have a right to are being vandalized because the people themselves don't take responsibility for them. I mean, it's not the role of the government, for example, to make sure that our water sources remain clean. It's all of our responsibility as people. So cooperative governance for me, I think, is a responsibility of all of us. We are living, unfortunately, in this country where people might think that our role stopped when we cast a vote. That is where the role starts, in my view. You cast a vote to elect particular officials who we are now giving a mandate, but we're giving them a mandate and we have to then go alongside them to co-create this reality that we wanted, or we mandated them to fight for us for. So I feel is critical. Without the people next to governance and government, we will have these issues that we're sitting with in this country. Rights alone is not enough. With those rights come responsibilities too.
So you're really talking about it as a social contract, which goes to the heart of how people are governed and how they govern themselves, and what roles and responsibilities, leaders in government who are put there through the electoral system, what do they take on, and what role do we as citizens take on, and working together around that. Okay.
Yeah.
Paul, what's your take on collaborative governance?
I hadn't really considered it until probably 7 years ago as something that was important. And then in dealing with municipalities and with communities and wanting to help, we slowly got to understand the fragmentation that's actually disabling development. And the fragmentation is at multiple levels. It was polarization of communities, either on religious or financial or apartheid architecture or whatever. And within government itself, it was the lack of alignment between politics and administration. And this misalignment of people was what the problem was. So all the issues that people were fighting about were actually symptoms of a greater problem, which was the ability to collaborate. And so as I started thinking about collaboration a bit more, we started realizing also the impact of co-creation and how it impacts the quality of ideation. And in order to enter that space effectively, people, like Marlene said, people had to shift and stop holding their own agendas and own opinions too closely to their heart, and open their minds to listen to other opinions. And we found that solutions got better and more sustainable if people did that. And so that's why we're in the space of collaborative governance. Yeah.
And of course, in this country, but in many other countries, we do come from a history of polarization and fractured relationships and unequal relationships and hurt relationships. And if we don't attend to that, we will persist with the low trust environment, which means it's difficult to reach agreements on what needs to be done, which minimizes the impact of development projects if people are just simply not agreeing on what the priorities are, and owning that. And that's, Marlene, comes back to, co-designing is one of the techniques to deliver long-lasting, not just projects, but the relationships that go with the projects. So I think we all agree that it's not just important, but it's at the heart of any democratic and placemaking goal in any society. It's enshrined in our constitution in this country. It's enshrined in other bits of legislation. But does it work? And perhaps just reflecting, starting with you, Marlene, what are just some of the barriers that undermine getting that collaboration going and getting a sort of two-way governance going?
Yeah, I think from what we see and experience is the level of disengagement by communities for various reasons impact how communities participate. I think we come from a space where there used to be engagement, voice, advocacy for community as a collective, and we've shifted away from that, and there's just a sense of disengagement. What we see in the spaces that we do work, there are individuals who lead, and the support that's needed is to have the sense of collaboration and this connectedness around leaders who want to do in their communities. And that is the support that's needed, because otherwise people feel that they are standing on their own, trying to fix here and fix there. I also think that because we have allowed, as communities, politics to play in our space of engagement and do on behalf of us, that's where the rest of us as community have just begun to sit back and not engage, not in politics and not otherwise in the solutions that we need in our communities. And so it's a tricky space, because communities are frustrated, and how do you re-engage them? And I think our work based on building trust is to allow people to tell their stories of and their lived experiences of the challenges that they have about lack of water and how it impacts across. So what is helpful is when people begin to listen to each other and each other's stories around water shortages. The experience of the Goko in the township around water shortage is very different to the guest house in the town, and it impacts them both. And how do they understand each other's stories and advocate for the collective, and not just because I own a guest house and it impacts my customers. It impacts your staff who come from the townships and those kind of. So there needs to be a collective storytelling and perspective seeing that shifts our lens of the situation as well. That we need to invite each other into, and with that go with collective solutions and a collective voice on these solutions.
I mean, I'd like to come back to this point about identifying a common agenda based on, despite possible differences in a community, and of course there are many differences, but where are the common interests between the granny or the gogo who is without water in the guest house in the other part of town, Boerdorp, Onderdorp, how do we bring different sides together of the traditional divides that we've got? Yeah. Jeremy, can I ask you, why do you think so many citizens at the moment seem very disengaged, even cynical, mistrustful? We have a long history in this country of civic activism, youth groups, women's groups, religious groups, all mobilizing and fighting for change. Where's that gone?
Good question. I think it has gone with that single enemy that we fought, right? So in the past, we as South Africans had the single enemy of apartheid, the apartheid government that we wanted to overthrow. And that united everyone. It was like we were all on the same boat fighting this evil. But now we attained our democracy, and we didn't have this single enemy anymore. So what are we all working towards together? I don't think we've done a very good job in this country to create new social contracts, to create new visions for our country together, where we can kind of think about what do we want to be. So we know exactly what we don't want to be. But what is it that we actually aspire to? So things like the the various development plannings that is happening in South Africa, right? So none of those development plans it feels like it speaks to what the real ordinary people want. They're not informed by the desires of ordinary people normally. They might be informed by people in high-rise buildings that are deciding the development direction that the country should take. So I feel people might feel disengaged because they feel powerless. They feel like they don't have a role to play. And an opportunity in that, I suppose, is that we always have a moment to pause and to think about when can we actually, every year, for example, at the local government level, annually, we have an opportunity to think about development in our place through the IDP process, for example. But we hardly ever find moments to really reflect on how do we actually, you talk about place building, right? How do we want to see our place? Can we agree on that? So I do feel that people feel powerless. They don't have a role to play because they didn't have a say in where this country is headed. The country in its development is happening to people. People don't feel that they have co-created or had an input or a say in where this country is developing to. So things are happening to people. Hence, people disengage. And people kind of revert back into their own egocentric worlds where it's about me now. I need to self-preservation mode because there's nothing working on collectively. So I'd rather just look out for me, myself, and my own. So I feel there's opportunity for us through these various processes annually, through development processes. But yeah, I think that disengagement comes from things like that. And also, I mean, trust has been lost, right? I mean, we had discussions this morning. Central theme, lack of trust at the local level for various reasons. I mean, people go to different churches. They support different political parties. They support different rugby teams. We are just so polarized as a nation. So we can hardly support the Springboks because our Western Province players were not picked. So I do feel that all of that adds to this piece of us being completely disengaged because we don't trust each other necessarily.
Okay. So I think what I'm hearing from you is that a key piece of this collaborative governance is helping people find this shared vision and shared purpose.
Yeah.
Because otherwise the atomization and fragmentation continues.
Yeah.
And we're kind of pulling each other apart and down. And also your point about, if people do not feel empowered or if they're not able to empower themselves, if you feel powerless, you feel helpless, your voice is muted and you don't feel you can take agency. You're waiting for someone else somewhere in government to solve your problems. And if you get to that stage, we know government on its own simply cannot solve all the problems. So, Paul, your experience of citizens feeling disillusioned, disengaged, what do you think has caused that, in your opinion?
When times are tough, I think people tend to try and protect their asset base or adopt a lager mentality, and also start being very egocentric about life. And so in South Africa, with the state of the economy and the growing unemployment and poverty, I think this mentality is growing. So people will do exactly what Jeremy was referring to. They look for belonging elsewhere in smaller groups. And unfortunately, leadership is taking us down that road as well when we are vulnerable into belonging to something, and anything that doesn't agree with us is our enemy. And that's creating sort of a sense of polarization, and people are finding comfort in those areas. So I think from an extraction perspective, we have to work on people to build a new why. We have to give people the hope that the collective perspective of their space is their responsibility. And that's going to take some strong, courageous leadership to break down the barriers that exist at the moment, to move people to that ego system-centric type thinking, where what I do and the decisions I make must be for the greater good of community and not for myself. And we've seen multiple businesses in small towns, for example, end up shutting down because they thought that putting up solar panels and boreholes and using gas in their kitchens to run a restaurant was enough. But with the local economy declining as much as it did, there were no patrons. And so it doesn't help to be self-sufficient. One can only thrive on the prosperity of others around you. And so that's the work we have to do, is work on individuals and leaders to drive that sentiment.
So Marlene, I mean, quite a lot of talk this morning was about how our system and our society has been battered by things like state capture, by local mafias, by sometimes municipalities or other parts of the state functioning almost like criminal enterprises rather than organs of government. I mean, where does ethics come into leadership and collaborative governance?
Yeah, it's a little bit unfortunate because it's almost non-existent. And the people in public service who want to do good, it feels like they are few and far between and get kind of drowned out in terms of the corruption and extortion and everything that's happening. One of the things that we need to reflect on is what is each one's individual work that we need to do as we take on this role of providing service and doing in communities, and how do we show up authentically. It's a long journey. My belief is, and I'm going to put you on the spot, and Andrew, as well as you, Jeremy, Paul knows, I'm curious about, so you work in the space of trauma and healing as part of your work, and I hope some of it can be edited out if we feel it's not kosher. Jeremy, you once told the story of about transformation and how it is a spiritual journey of healing in a community where you come from, where historically there were so many injustices, and now shifting into working with, in the small town, working with the other side of the tracks. So kind of to answer your question, I'm asking the question, what is the healing that we need to do as a country? And why are leaders showing up with this sometimes excuse of the behavior and trying to justify it as kind of redress and transformation? That's why we are entitled to. And then the other is also how do we, as we transform these spaces, I intentionally focus on the social transformation and I guess the transformation of the soul that needs to happen, as well as the economic transformation. So it's only to say that our ethics and our morals, it just feels like we have to go down to a primitive level of individual and collective questioning of where do we come from, what's the hurts that we carry, and how do we heal? And I will also say I'm cynical sometimes about it, and it's the truth that the fish rots from the head. How we model leadership and how leaders show up, right, just gives either a sense of lawlessness across the country or a sense of leadership, collaboration, ethics and morals. So what is it that leaders need to do in how they show up? Our political leaders, our business leaders, civil society as well. So I think those are questions that I'm rather throwing out than, yeah.
Well, it comes down at the heart to building relationships of trust with potential partners. And like on an individual level, we don't like being with a partner that we can't trust. We will end that relationship. You want to be able to believe and trust in your partners. And if your partners, now talking at an institutional level, are displaying a lack of ethics, a lack of morals, a lack of care, why do you even want to get into a partnership with them? It inhibits collaborative governance, and people will run a mile before they want to work with someone who's perceived as not having the right ethics and morals and moral compass. Marlene, on your other question. I mean, I often find when we're working with groups that want to go forward and want to develop let's say, a common vision for the town or the village or the city or the country even, and say everyone must participate and we want to be inclusive. But there's still a sense of stuckness. People are not coming on that journey, or it's a grudge purchase. They'll pitch to the meeting, but they won't really buy into the project. And then you wonder why you need another national dialogue 5 years' time. And I think it's because we sometimes don't go back in order to go forward. If we go back to placemaking, the impact of our history was that places were shattered. So you say, where do you come from? To someone in Manenberg, and they'll say, I come from District 6, but that doesn't exist anymore. But they carry it with them in their hearts. So where do they come from? And if anyone can't answer that question of who am I, where do I come from, who's my community, then you can't form relationships. You struggle at an individual and a collective level. So building a sense of solidarity and collective action and cooperation has to take those things into account. Sometimes people physically are unable to do that unless you've addressed past traumas, or at least acknowledged them. That would be that part of the work to go forward. You've got to also go back, not to wallow in the past, but to actually address it honestly. Jeremy, your views?
I agree. Interesting question, that, because I think we tend to obviously go back to where we feel comfortable, right? So if we feel comfortable within our peoples or within our clan, then we'd navigate towards our clan when they go and get stuff outside, right? So I think often what happens is, when it comes to transformation and healing, you unfortunately will have to go to places that is uncomfortable, and people don't want that. It's tough, right? It's tough to look that white person in the face that actually stole your farm, right? And they say, no, but I didn't steal the farm. Maybe my grandparents did, but I didn't. But still, your grandfather stole my farm. So essentially, it is that piece about, we're going to have to understand that nothing is happening in a vacuum. Things are connected. And as a country, for some reason, people want us to forget the past. And forcing people to forget the past is forcing them to, it's essentially not allowing them to heal. Now, I'm saying all of this just to say that the work that goes into this, personally, if I take this just purely from a personal perspective, is I had to, and I still have to, put myself in situations where ordinarily I wouldn't be comfortable. I would have to go, I started joining this golf club and play golf with these Afrikaner farmers. Why? Because these Afrikaner farmers are my people. They're my community. And I need to understand that these are my people. And I feel that this healing work requires us to go beyond those boundaries that we've set, superficial boundaries, that we would have set ourselves through our culture, through our norms and practices. That makes us, apartheid was just a very successful project. That's the truth. It's a really successful project. And we need to acknowledge that. And then we need to ask ourselves, okay, so what are we learning from this? How do we build back better? And we have a daily opportunity to do that by stepping over those superficial barriers that have been set there.
Jeremy, thanks for that. And Marlene, thanks for the questions. Paul, this morning we heard that despite quite adverse conditions and a lot of barriers and problems and challenges, that cooperative governance and local cooperative governance in particular is not just desirable but actually possible. And there was a lot of talk about getting the right conditions in place, getting the right enablers in place. Do you want to reflect a little bit about what are some of those enablers that we work to get in place to enable these local collaborations and cooperations to take place?
I think the most important enabler and we've used this phrase quite a lot, is we need to get people to connect before we worry about the content. So let's not worry about the water and electricity and refuse collection until we've taken enough time to build a relationship that that can be built on respect to start off with, because there may not be trust in place, built on integrity, and built on honesty. If we can do that on a more frequent basis, and often we refer to the cup of coffee as more valuable than talking about the water crisis. And let's ask each other about our families, and let's get to know, understand what people are thinking, where they've come from, what their context is like, and compare that to ours, and then build a new context for each other. Because whatever we take going forward in solving the issues is not going to be one or the other context. It's going to be a combination of both that's going to make the difference going forward. And that's where the common why exists, where we can remove our contexts and take up a new baton and run with it. So for me, that would be probably the biggest. And then the personal shift, to pitch up in a way that I understand myself. I understand what my historical triggers are. And I'm not going to let those triggers stand in the way of collaboration. And they can quite easily do that. And then to take time to understand other people's triggers so that I can avoid pressing the button that aggravates them. We then also have to adopt a position of non-defensiveness on our own attitudes and our own perspectives and start embracing co-creation in a more positive way. We have to negotiate consistently with the intention of being collaborative. And we must hold each other accountable. I must hold myself accountable first for what I promise to do, and I must hold the other person accountable for what they said they were going to do. I think if we get some of those things right up front, any problem is potentially solvable. Because I don't think much of the issues discussed this morning were symptoms of a deeper problem. And the deeper problem was, are we getting the right people around the table to discuss, with the right skills and capabilities to solve problems? And I don't think we're doing that.
I really like your emphasis on connect. In my practice, I use the 3 C's as useful shorthand when you're working with groups and communities of connect, communicate, collaborate. Okay. And the collaboration doesn't happen unless you've, as you said, first connected around a common humanity and communicated what needs to be said in a non-aggressive and non-defensive way, and communicated accurately and genuinely. But then, Paul, you were talking about a lot of the kind of what people refer to as the soft skills of development, you know, and emotional and social intelligence being one of them. But those are the hardest things to change for us as individuals, but then collectively. Marlene, I mean, what in your own practice, in your own work, I mean, how have you addressed changing attitudes at the personal level?
Yeah. And I think it comes back to, so linked to what Paul said, creating the environment where people show up with the right ethics and morals, right? So connection is very important. Taking the time to go slow and build relationships of trust where we see each other as human beings and not as like on the other side. And with that, it is going to deeper processes of listening to each other, where people can tell stories and people authentically listen. But also just in terms of our human relations, recognize how much we have in common, that we all want love, care, respect, comfortable place, right? So if we have those common needs, how do we build it for ourselves and for each other? I feel that the storytelling and the journey of that storytelling between those who see each other as enemies in essence can be such a gift that helps them to bridge their relationships. Because through our stories, we always realize, like I saw Jeremy and Elsona from CSIR this morning, excited because they come from the same place, right? And Elsona was like, oh, I know his grandmother. The joy of that and that relationship that people need to build through having coffee, understand what are some of the stuck points, and talking through that. One-on-one relationships matter. And sometimes what we see is once we establish those relationships, even if it's on a social, it feels social, but that connection helps build the professional and the work relationship as well. So part of what we also say is go slow to go fast, right? And if we slow down a little bit and build those relationships with the people that are most different from us, it's such a gift. And if we stay curious, so when we go into these towns, in Modimolle, for example, we ask the question, why is the mountain so important? Because there's this big mountain as you drive through or past Modimolle that we all see, and everyone connects to it in some historic, spiritual, cultural, or just touristy way, and it matters, right? And so that commonality of storytelling make them realize that we care for, and there's commonality in what we care for, and we're not going anywhere, so let's fix where we are. So it's a slower process, and when people come to that realization, it's almost like a catalyst for the other things that need to happen. Yeah.
I mean, I like that starting point that you mentioned of what is the common experience of the physical landscape of place and the living landscape that we are part of, before we get into the more complicated part of the cultural or human landscape, which can be very polarized and difficult. Jeremy, in your experience working with communities, I mean, are there any other enablers that promote the ability to work together, form partnerships, have a common understanding with things? What are your other experiences?
Yeah, I would say, look, our work is very much around, so we run a community foundation. It is called the Initiative for Community Advancement. You said it in different ways earlier, but it's fine. So the community foundation, and what is enabling, I suppose, and we had a lot of discussion this morning about this, is we need institutions. We need strong institutions at the local level. Often what happens, now I come from a rural place, so often what happens in the rural communities, they are not very strong, well-organized, professionally run institutions that people trust, that people want to invest in, and that actually does impactful work at the local level. So enabling environment, what helps that too is to create institutions, and in our case it's a community foundation, that gives opportunity for ordinary citizens, for corporate citizens and others, to co-invest through pooled financial assets or mechanisms, to co-invest, and for that money to then to be plowed back into the community towards projects that the community truly cares about. Now, that, in my view, is very much like what the church used to do. Like the church was really a pillar of a community because we all believed in this thing together. We had this in common. Now, if we can identify institutions or build institutions at the local level that are strong, like I said, that are professional, that are impactful, and people can really trust them, then suddenly everyone feels this is our institution. It's our community foundation. And the impact that this organization is bringing in our community is all of our impact. It is not the impact of the government. It is what we are doing. So through this, we need to find a way to give ordinary people skin in the game. Because if the funds are only going to come from big corporations that are local, it's going to have to come from government, but ordinary people don't see that they're contributing to this with their own investment, then they'll always feel outside. They won't feel they are part of. Now the community foundation gives them an opportunity to do that. But it's not only community foundations that offer people opportunities to do this. There are various institutions at the local level that are not supported, they're not strengthened, because there's a lot of competition for resource. So I think an enabling environment is to actually create local philanthropy institutions where funding can actually go to those very civil society organizations that we all depended on during COVID. Where NGOs were the ones that we all looked at to bring food to communities, to bring healthcare services. It was NGOs playing a fundamental role and a very important role. But those NGOs are now not looked at anymore. And so I do feel all of this is an ecosystem. I think, Paul, this morning you spoke about having an ecosystem-centric approach. It is important to build strong institutions at various levels. Civil society too. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think I couldn't agree with you more. A place without strong and enduring institutions really struggles, because families and households on their own need support. They need structure to hold on to, whatever that institution is. I mean, whether it's the church or the mosque, or whether there's still a library that functions in an area and the kids can go and read there and be taught by a librarian. I mean, certainly that's played in past years, that was very important. But even a functioning school or a functioning clinic, and sometimes these are public sector and sometimes they're private or community institutions, but they're absolutely critical. And I've always found the first thing you've got to do is map out that ecosystem and kind of add up the institutional assets of that community and see whether they're in deficit or there's places to cling on to sustain engagement over time. Paul, other enablers?
I mean, one really important thing for me is I think we must understand that the system's been held ransom by a small minority. I think the majority of people that we work with in communities and in fact local government are really competent and able to do a good job given the opportunity to do so. So I think from a collaborative governance perspective, we have to create a critical mass of people supporting collaborative governance. And I think that critical mass will shift the tide in terms of how we weed out those people that are holding communities and government to ransom. I'm not very confident that would be a peaceful process. One of my fears is that would be a violent process at some point where people fight for the wealth that comes with controlling society. But I think we have to just focus on one of the comments this morning, looking 20 years down the line, and can we build a community of practice that will practice collaborative governance with or without institutions around, but within their own communities, with their own structures and guidance and leadership.
And as I understand it, that's something that both Synagos and Kagiso Trust, amongst others, are very interested in advancing and supporting and convening. How do we bring all the people that are involved in relationship building, trust building, partnership building, be they in government or be they in communities or NGOs or churches or wherever, we've got to get them together and we've got to show them that there's mutual learning and solidarity amongst everyone.
And that would include business leaders as well.
Yeah.
Everyone's got to adopt this collaborative approach to creating a prosperous country.
Yeah. And I do think like the best place where we can focus is on community engagement and building strong community foundations, like the Makana Circle of Unity, where community continues to be ready to come together. And yes, we see politically coalitions are not going to end, right? There's going to be more and more coalitions. So politicians need to figure themselves out if they want to play in that space. But the more we strengthen and ready community leadership, so community business, civil society, faith-based taxi hawkers associations, all of those players in a community, the more ready they are for the collaboration that's already happening and needs to happen, the better politicians will come along the way. Yeah. I think the other that we know for sure is that the systems are complex. It takes a long time because of the wicked problems we deal with to transform the systems, and it goes at a slow pace. And we need government to be able to change, to shift the systems. And so I think it's really getting community ready and politicians and administration of local government to come along and so that we can move forward. But the disengagement of community allows for the ethics and the morals to go down the drain because there's no sense of accountability and transparency because there's the disconnect between community, business, and local government.
So our time together on this podcast is unfortunately coming to an end. I'd like to just quickly go around, starting with you, Paul, and say what gives you hope?
Community gives me hope. the way communities will rally around a good cause, given the opportunity, and organize themselves to champion a positive cause for the greater good is really important. And that gives me hope.
Jeremy?
For me, it's young people in these communities. So, I mean, when I look around and I engage with young people, we have a different breed of young people now, right? So we don't necessarily have the activists that are going to take to the streets always. But we certainly have young people that are aware of those players or those agents who is taking the hardship of the poor to their advantage, and they're calling them out. So I have a lot of hope in a new breed of leaders that we are seeing, or might not even be seeing, because they are not in the public eye, but young people who are certainly understanding that if we're going to change our community, it starts with the self. I'm going to have to change me first, and then from there, it's going to have a ripple effect and actually become a role model for others to look at. So my hope comes from just looking at young people. They are the future. In fact, they are the now. We should older people, at times, they have to just step aside and allow young people to lead, because they are certainly capable.
I will take that under advisement, as they say, as a representative of the older generation. Marlene, what gives you hope?
I have to say, looking at Jeremy just totally gives me hope. Like the work that you do, it gives me hope that other communities can come together in this way. So you have a lot of wisdom to share, and I hope you do. But also just coming together in community as we did today, practitioners and experts in different ways. What gives me hope is the heart with which everyone shows up with. I really celebrate that, and the knowing that we are all working towards this because it matters. It's no fun doing this kind of work. There's a lot of risk, I feel. Sometimes that goes into it, and just as a collective and a community doing this, and how do we stay resilient and support each other as we all do the work, both public officials and organizations in this space. So I am hopeful. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Paul, to Jeremy, to Marlene for being my fellow prisoners of hope, as the saying goes. And thanks to our audience for listening.
Yeah, great.
Thank you, Andrew.